Welcome to LinguisticsTube. This episode is part of my series which explores the skills involved in debating. Through these episodes, you will learn and practice several essential techniques that will allow you to perform debates successfully and easily. In this episode, we will explore the skill of refuting the other team's arguments. This episode is somewhat the opposite of the previous episode, which focused on how to create strong arguments for your own team. So, watch that episode first if you haven't already. We'll learn about two things in this episode. Firstly, we will examine how to create a rebuttal. Secondly, we'll explore advice for improving your ability to refute the other team. Firstly, before we learn about refuting in detail, I would like you to read a short speech. It is on the next screen, so pause the video while you read it. Even though the speech is written as one big paragraph, it contains three sections. Firstly, a viewpoint, which is called the thesis statement. Secondly, there are three arguments. And finally, there is a conclusion. The topic of the speech is industrialization. And if you are my student, then we will use this text in our next lesson. Please pause the video now and read the speech. Now, let's move on to refuting. An entire, complete rebuttal has several parts. However, when you need to refute something, I recommend that you start with the most important part of a rebuttal, the counterargument. Therefore, if you are here to learn how to refute, then you should firstly create simple counterarguments to the thing that you want to refute. So, what is a counterargument? It is simply an argument that attacks or argues against another argument. Like I said, this is the most important part of a rebuttal, so it's not the only part. Therefore, to create a full rebuttal, you not only need to state an argument against the argument, you also need to explain why the other team's argument is weak, and therefore why your argument is strong. Altogether, a counterargument plus an evidence-based explanation is called a rebuttal, and successful, complete rebuttals have 4 parts. Let's look at them now. The first part of a rebuttal is called restate. Simply put, you need to state the argument that you will refute in order to remind your audience of it. They will have already heard it, but they may have forgotten the details. To begin part 1, you can use phrases like "they said" and "the other team said." I have some suggestions for making part 1 as strong as possible. Firstly, you only need to briefly summarize the other team's argument. You don't need to repeat everything that they said, because the audience has already heard it in detail. Secondly, I recommend that you take notes during the other team's speeches, so that you remember exactly what they argued. It would be awkward if you don't remember exactly what they said and restate their argument incorrectly. In fact, the other team could easily attack you for it. Finally, you should always use the third person when referring to the other team. Thus, use they. You should avoid using the second person because it could feel like an ad hominem attack. Or, in other words, it might appear as if you are personally criticizing a member of the other team. So, don't use you say. Here is an example. For this rebuttal, I'll use the topic that we've seen several times in this series. Smoking should be banned in public places. The argument that we are refuting is that smoking is harmful for non-smokers. Therefore, part 1 of the rebuttal is simply, the other team said that smoking is harmful for non-smokers. Remember that the other team probably said it in more detail, but you should restate it as simply and briefly as possible. Next is the second part of a rebuttal, which I'll call refute. This is where you state your counter-argument, which is the main point of your rebuttal. Remember that this is the main reason why you disagree with the other team's argument, or why you think that their argument is weak. To begin part 2 of the rebuttal, you can use phrases like, "But I disagree," and "That may be true, but..." After these words, you can immediately state your counter-argument. Here are 2 examples. "That may be true, but if smokers want to avoid cigarette smoke, they can surely walk away from it." And, "But I disagree, because if non-smokers want to avoid cigarette smoke, they can surely walk away from it." Next is the third part of a rebuttal, called support. As the name suggests, after presenting your counter-argument, you need to support it with high-quality logical reasoning and evidence. You can begin this section with any phrase that introduces an explanation. The easiest one is, "This is because." So, for example, using the same topic, you could support your counter-argument by saying, "This is because non-smokers should look after their own health." Finally, you will finish your rebuttal with the part called conclude. The best way to complete a rebuttal is to state exactly why your argument is more valid than the other team's argument. Just like completing an argument, your conclusion should be a wrap-up sentence, which takes into account the argument that you stated in part 2 and the support that you provided in part 3. Thus, you shouldn't simply repeat the opposite of part 1. I'll show you an example of this on the next screen to demonstrate what I mean. You should begin part 4 with a word like therefore. Here is an example of part 1. The other team said that smoking is harmful for non-smokers. A weak part 4 would simply repeat the opposite of part 1, which does basically demonstrate that the other team is wrong and your team is right. For example, therefore, smoking is not harmful for non-smokers. However, this is not a very interesting way to conclude your rebuttal. Instead, a stronger way to conclude the rebuttal is to meaningfully tell the audience why your argument is more valid than the other team's argument. For example, therefore, it is obviously not the responsibility of smokers to protect non-smokers. Let's put all of this together and look at a very simple example for another topic. The argument that we will refute is, semesters at Chinese universities should last for 50 weeks in total. That might not make much sense, so let me provide some context. Currently, at Chinese universities, the semesters last for a total of 40 weeks. There are in fact 2 semesters which last for 20 weeks each. This means that there are currently 12 weeks of holiday per year, as there are 6 weeks of holiday between each semester. However, some people believe that this is too much free time, and university students should have the same amount of holiday as people with full-time jobs. Therefore, these people argue that there should only be 2 weeks of holiday per year. Let's read a rebuttal of this argument, which contains the 4 parts. The affirmative team say that semesters at Chinese universities should last for a total of 50 weeks, but we still believe that they should last for only 40 weeks, because students need enough time to do other things like rest, see family and friends, and go on holidays. Therefore, 50 weeks of study is detrimental to students, parents, and even university staff. To make this even better, you can add a piece of evidence to support your information in Part 3. For example, after "go on holidays," you could add, a 2018 study by researchers at Peking University found that students at 50-week semester universities had 25% lower final grades than students at 40-week semester universities. You can learn more about supporting arguments with evidence in the episode about the body section of a public speech. In the final section of this episode, I will share with you 4 pieces of advice for improving your ability to refute arguments. The first piece of advice, which you must take into account before attempting to refute the other team's arguments, is that you must fully know and understand your own team's arguments. If you need to perform in a debate, then there are 2 possibilities regarding the amount of preparation that is possible. Firstly, you might be able to prepare with your teammates beforehand, and secondly, you might not. Let's discuss these 2 situations in more detail. You may be in the first situation if you are doing a final project for a debating course. In this situation, you and your teammates usually have the opportunity to plan, prepare, and practice together, because projects like this examine your ability to demonstrate debating skills. They don't demonstrate your ability to actually have a genuine debate. In this situation, your debate can be prepared in advance. Therefore, you must be very familiar with your team's arguments, evidence, as well as what you would say in order to defend your arguments from the other team's rebuttals. If you want to, then you and your teammates are welcome to create your arguments, evidence, and defenses together. In contrast, the second situation means that you don't have the opportunity to prepare with your teammates before the debate. This will most likely be a real debate, because in a real debate, the teammates do not prepare together beforehand. So, real debates feel spontaneous and like a genuine conversation. In this situation, you may not be familiar with your teammates' speeches. Therefore, you must pay attention to not only what the other teams say, but also what your teammates say. To do this, you must make notes during the debate by writing down your teammates' points, as well as the other team's points. My second piece of advice is to fix your team's weaknesses before they are exploited by the other team. What do I mean by this? Well, if you can already see a hole in your viewpoint, arguments, or evidence that the other team will attempt to attack in their rebuttals, then they will definitely see it too. Therefore, it is essential to attempt to mitigate or downplay the weaknesses in your team's side of the topic before the debate happens, in order to reduce the likelihood of it being exploited. My third piece of advice is to get into the mindset of the other team. This means that during the preparation for your debate, it is useful to pretend that you are on the other team and you will need to refute your own team. Thus, you need to think about how you would attack your team's arguments, evidence, and defenses. In order to do this, you should spend time creating rebuttals of your own team's viewpoint, arguments, and evidence. Doing this is called playing the devil's advocate, and we can define it as pretending to be against an idea in order to make people think about it in more detail. Therefore, if you play the devil's advocate during your preparation, you may be able to find weaknesses that you didn't notice before, you may be able to create stronger arguments, and even be able to select higher quality evidence. Finally, my fourth piece of advice for creating strong arguments is to find weaknesses in the other team's arguments before the debate happens. Of course, you won't actually know what the other team will argue beforehand. Therefore, you should prepare for a real debate by predicting the other team's arguments and evidence. You will be able to do this by getting into the other team's mindset. After doing this, you can then create rebuttals for the arguments and evidence that you predicted. In order to find weaknesses in the other team's viewpoint, arguments, and evidence, I recommend that you ask and answer these questions about the other team. Firstly, do any of their arguments contradict any of their other arguments? Secondly, does an argument's evidence not support the argument or seem inappropriate for that argument? In other words, do you feel like the argument and evidence are not well connected? Thirdly, if one of their arguments seems weak or subjective, can you attack it with logic? And finally, similar to number 3, if the other team uses subjective or low-quality evidence to support an argument, can you attack it with high-quality, objective evidence? These 4 questions are not only useful during your preparation while predicting the other team's arguments. You can also answer these questions during your debate, while you are spontaneously creating rebuttals for their arguments and evidence. This is the end of the episode about creating strong and convincing rebuttals of the other team's arguments. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my Debating Skills series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.